he has great book titles. So his first book is a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and its title is Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation. Is that a cool title or what? Next title, okay, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire. Okay. And then book of poems is Songs Older Than Any Known Singer. Okay, so the titles alone pull you in with your imagination. Anyway, John is here. So John, we're ready for the show. John Phillip Santos, please.
Good evening, everybody. Buenas tardes. Good evening. What an honor to be with you tonight. And I want to thank everybody who's made this journey possible. My comrade, Professor Berberick here. I don't know if he mentioned this in his introduction, but we have history. We were at El Otro Notre Dame together. There's Notre Dame, the Notre Dame you know, the kind of the big football Notre Dame. And there is El Otro Notre Dame. El Otro Notre Dame is the Notre Dame of literature, art, culture, insurrection, and heresy, all of which we trafficked in together. So we were part of a group of students who really sought to use literary means to illuminate new ideas and helped bring a lot of writers to Notre Dame, and it was a huge period of really influential time for me. Yeah.
No, it's
So,
okay.
yeah, can we hear?
No,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
I usually don't need a mic, in
It's all right.
fact.
We're good.
I usually raise your hand if you're not hearing things properly. Okay. So I'm super honored to be here, and I hope you will not hold my remarks against Professor Berberick this evening. So a caution note there. It's particularly auspicious to be in Galveston for me, from San Antonio, from Bexar County, because this is the place, the Isla Malado, as it was referred to by our comrade Cabeza de Vaca, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who I think was addressed in an earlier talk in the series. The fact that he lands here, or we think hereabouts, and makes his way as quickly as he can to Bexar County. He heads for Bexar County. He makes a very close pass, at least, by San Antonio, Texas. So it's always auspicious for me to come to Galveston, because the story of Cabeza de Vaca, which I will refer to a little later, is really an important one for the story that deeply interests me about the first encounters between the indigenous world and the Europeans, the Spaniards, what took place in Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca lands here in Galveston in 1528, 7 years after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec world. So it's a really important story to remind us of this other origin story, this other American origin story. We're familiar with 1776. We have been importantly reminded of the importance of 1619, the arrival of African slaves. And then there's 1521, the beginning of the Mexican story, the merging of Iberian and indigenous stories. So what I want to do tonight is really focused on, let me just see if I can get this working here. Okay. What I want to do tonight is really aimed at some reflections. They're partly involved with things that are going on at UTSA, where I teach now, where we're beginning to create an interdisciplinary school of humanities studies within the College of Liberal and Fine Arts. So we're thinking a lot about many different ways of undertaking a scholar's journey. So not restricting it perhaps to academic, professional models, but thinking about the many ways that we can carry forward scholarly inquiry no matter what kind of profession we pursue. So this is really a different kind of scholar's journey, in the case so much that deals with my own story. So a very different kind of scholar's journey, as you will see. How do we orient and prepare ourselves for a lifelong practice of inquiry about ourselves and the world, no matter what we choose to do as a profession? Now, long ago, in another century, I was on a very time-tested path towards the same old scholar's journey. I went to Notre Dame, I went to Oxford, I got to Yale, and at Yale, I had a director of graduate studies where I was pursuing a PhD, and he told me, "You don't belong here." And at the time that he told me this, I was more or less in agreement with him. I almost thought it was a compliment. I don't think he intended it as a compliment, but I sort of received it as a compliment. We'd already had some battles. We had battled over Spanish language as a modern language. So there was a requirement in the graduate studies arena there of accomplishing fluency in a modern language. What was a modern language? French and German were modern languages. Spanish was not a modern language, at least according to Yale at that time. So my first battle was to establish Spanish as a modern language, as accomplishing that requirement. And he lost that battle, which didn't endear him to me. So we had some history before we got to the point of, you don't belong here. But in fact, at the time we had this conversation, I told him I really didn't plan on being an academic. I wasn't planning to be a professor. I knew that would get his goat. It was partly the kind of motivation of telling him that. I wanted to make documentaries. I'd grown up as a poet, but poetry had sort of become an elite aesthetic practice. And I thought, well, maybe I could use poetic language in documentaries. More people could get the ideas. More people could get a sense of the deeper meanings of what was transpiring, what was happening politically, culturally in the United States and around the world. So we agreed I didn't belong there. And I returned to San Antonio, Texas. This is San Antonio, Texas. Slightly before I returned, this is early 20th century, but San Antonio is a place of great history, more than 300 years old, founded 200 years after the conquest of the Aztec Empire. So it took 2 centuries before the project of colonial New Spain arrived in central Texas to found the city of San Antonio. But I grew up in this place, a secret Mexican city, as we thought of it, a secret Mexican city at the very heart of Texas that carried this deep link to the past that emerged from the South, from the world of Mexico, from the world of the indigenous. So, as I returned to San Antonio, I was thinking, well, where am I in this story now? I had been involved in pursuing a scholar's journey, Notre Dame, Oxford, Yale, for more than 8 years by that time. Maybe that was over. I'd made lots of friends who remained in the academic world, but I took this detour. I took the exit ramp. I left the big scholarship behind, the Tony New Haven campus, the prestige, to return to San Antonio. It was always about San Antonio. How many here are first gen? You know first gen, what first gen means? First gen. So first generation of folks in our familial lines pursuing higher ed. So I am first gen on my dad's side. This is our family, the Santos Garcia family, is the subject of my first book, places left unfinished at the time of creation. This is me here in a bow tie. The only time I was ever photographed in a bow tie, under protest. But we were first, all of us, the cousins of this era, first gen. This lad right here is now head of the American Census Department, Rhodes Santos. Other cousins got PhDs and pursued careers in academia, but we were first gen. On my mom's side, my mom is here. My grandmother here. On my grandmother and mom's side, the Lopez Vela side, that's the subject of my second book, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire, we were third gen. So my grandmother, in around 1899, went to Teachers College in Huntsville from Laredo, Texas, which must have been like heading for the North Pole at that time, undertaking an overland journey from Laredo to Huntsville. My mom ultimately got a PhD in education. So in this family, I was third gen. First gen, third gen. But you think about our families. You think about our families carrying these stories. So my grandmother and her sister Fermina, who was an albina, she was the white person in the family, the very white person in the family. Fermina and my grandmother taught in a school in Cotulla, Texas. So there was a part of the family that had been involved in education for some generations already. But I began thinking about all of those generations that preceded us. What about them? We're first gen in 2023, we're first gen? Really? I mean, how many generations of lived experience do we ignore when we think about ourselves as first gen? What are the other generations of knowledge and lived experience? What do they have to offer in terms of understandings of ourselves? So understanding of the self became a major orientation in terms of how I tried to retool some of the skills I developed as a young scholar to do a different kind of work, a different kind of study. I started my education with very strong military discipline at Mount Sacred Heart Catholic elementary school in San Antonio that, well, they asked me to leave in third grade. It was a theological dispute. I won't go into detail about it, but I left that path behind as well, the Catholic education path. I rejoined the program at Notre Dame, but when I go back and think about these times, we're imprinted with these ideas about who we are, military discipline, polishing brass under protest, or my very short-lived open carry 6-shooter phase. So another mythological imprint, military discipline, the Wild West. My comrade David Carrasco, a great scholar of ancient Mesoamerican religion, photographed in other regalia, born in El Paso, and carrying the tokens of our Mexican past, also open carry though. He was still carrying the 6-shooter there. So around the time that I was in high school, I began thinking a lot about what it means to become a poet, partly because of a meeting with a poet named Naomi Shihab Nye. I don't know if you know that name. Great Palestinian-American poet who grew up in San Antonio, Texas. How we find mentors early in our lives, early in the journey. Mentors and comrades. Who's going to be our ally in this journey? And what kinds of mentors can we find? In my case, I reached out to a writer. Her name was Laura Riding Jackson. She was a a celebrated poet of the early 20th century, and born in 1901, but by the 20s had established herself as a formidable poet. I started writing to her in the 70s, and she wrote back a 10-page letter, my first letter to her appreciating her work. She wrote back a 10-page letter. Didn't I know that she had repudiated poetry in 1938? She had repudiated not just her own poems, which she said, as poems go, her poems were probably the best that can be achieved, but that poetry fails. Poetry fails because it uses artifice as a tool rather than addressing how we best communicate truth. Poetry was about artifice, she was about truth.
So can you define artifice?
Artifice is, the apparatus of stanzas and cadence and rhyme and meter, all of those aspects of poetic craft that fascinate many, not all poets.
It made it irrelevant to truth because of that?
She was radical in that commitment, yeah. If you were thinking about how to structure a line of poetry, you were being distracted from the mission of telling the truth. And she got my attention on that. I've been a conflicted poet ever since. She said that there is something to be told about us for the telling of which we all wait. Many of the lesser things concerning us have been told, but the greater things have not been told. The greater things have not been told. And nothing besides told can suffice us. We shall go on quietly craving it. I began to think about this as a mission. That as a journalist, as a documentary filmmaker, as a conflicted poet, as a writer, I was interested in the missing story of ourselves. And what did that mean? To undertake the telling of a missing story of ourselves, the many generations of our ancestors I mentioned earlier, but how to deal with the present day. And I just want to show you a very quick clip of a documentary from the beginning of my very first film. You can watch it online. It's a film called Exiles Who Never Left Home, The Mexican-American Promise. I'll show you just one little clip in terms of this mission of using poetic language to do documentary storytelling.
The Rio Grande is a living boundary between nations, a threshold with a delicate life. Then birds of many kinds and breeds came into the pond, and I thought that never in the world would there be discovered other lands such as these. From the diary of one of the first missionaries in the 16th century. Rivers snake through all of Mexican civilization and often become embroiled in the politics of both countries. children use the river as a friend. Others have taken great risks as they secretly crossed from one side to the other. They became a name too. Wetbacks, looking for jobs and the status of living in the United States, to find a better life and freedom. And pedestrians too demonstrate how deeply linked the destinies of the countries actually are. A fossil Indian village under the bridge interplays with the glamorous ambassador of our times. In the many years of living in the lands that are now in the southwestern United States, many flags have flown over the heads of the Mexican Americans. In front of City Hall in San Antonio, the bleaching Texas sunlight is screened by trees over two eagles in combat with a snake, a symbol of Aztec history and the pride of the city's Hispanic community.
So I began trying to use media to tell the missing story of ourselves that Laura Riding Jackson had called on us to reckon with. How to think about using television, print media, and indeed later digital media forms to find that missing story of ourselves. That became the primary orientation in terms of this way of finding another scholar's path. So this film, Exiles Who Never Left Home, got an Emmy nomination in 1984, which got me an invitation to move to New York to make films for CBS News. And I made about 40 films over the next 8 years in about 18 different countries around the world. Films about liberation theology, about resurgent Islam, about new religious movements, about the spiritual and religious impact of the AIDS epidemic. It gave me an opportunity to witness the world, to be in places I never imagined being: Khartoum, Sudan, Nigeria and Kenya, the Mediterranean, Ephesus and Turkey, all over Latin America, and Peru, Nicaragua, Brazil. Finding that there was a great kinship between the worlds of those peoples and the world I grew up in, the world of the Mexican poor. The subjects of, certainly of this first book that deals with my father's families, the Santos Garcia families, and The Farthest Home is an Empire of Fire, which deals with my mom's families. The first book deals with Mexico and the indigenous world. The second book deals with my mom's family's links to Spain, across the Mediterranean, into Israel and Palestine and beyond. So, out of this journey, there are three questions that have been my main orienting questions. If we want to think about how we establish a nucleus of our own inquiry and seeking that can drive this lifelong adventure. And the three questions, they're very simple questions. They are, how do we connect to our most distant ancestry? How do we connect to our most distant ancestry? Ancestry beyond anything remembered or maybe even imagined in our family lines. Then, where are we in the ancestral story? And where is that story going? Who are we becoming? So if we go deep into our ancestral journeys, we then ask ourselves, who are we in that story? And who are we becoming? And the last question is really, instrumental in terms of a methodology. How can we open our attention to be witness to the unexpected revelations of the everyday? For a writer, it's often thought that, well, you gotta lay out a plan. You make an outline, you make a kind of a grand plan, and then you execute it. I've found actually that's helpful, but you almost always immediately diverge from the plan. You diverge from the plan because of the unexpected. So I try to, when I'm in pursuit of a story, to foreground the expectation of the unexpected, the inadvertent, what is not intended. That's usually where the revelations lie, in the unintended, not in what we plan. So this continues to be the orienting rubric, compass of my work. And my work today is really, ironically, my director of graduate studies probably would be chilled to know that I actually ended up in the academy. I ended up at in the university world again. I returned to the university world. So I teach in the Honors College at UTSA. I teach mestizo cultural studies, which means I teach a lot of crazy things. I teach the ancestral journey story, and then I'll teach every other term. I'll teach something out of the blue, as it were, something usually that I'm working on. So I thought maybe I would just give you a quick overview, very synoptic overview of things that are kind of in play right now. Projects and undertakings that are in play under 4 rubrics, under 4 different banners. One is an ongoing interest, and it's threaded through all of my writing, both of the books of memoirs and the poems, humanity's origins and the future of the human. It's linked to that question of how do we connect to our ancestry and who are we becoming? I've gotten really fascinated with genetic genealogy or genealogical genetics that show us, this is a kind of an upside or top-down map of the world that shows the diaspora of our ancestors. One of the things that we know about our ancestors, they were restless. And our DNA contains an exhaustive account of our ancestry. All of our ancestors have signed the guest book of our genome. We carry that regardless of whether we remember anything about who they were. And even more staggering than that, that's staggering enough, but even more staggering than that is the discovery that the genome is time-coded, that we can actually identify when our ancestors were where along these journeys out of Africa. Africa is at the top here. You see the red line, the red crescent here. Africa appears kind of counterintuitively. This one gives you a better kind of reckoning of all of the diasporas of our ancestors. So I've gotten really interested in how we tell that story as our story. How much of that story can we recover? You've probably seen some of Henry Louis Gates' American Roots series or the NBC series, Who Do You Think You Are? Those series tend to move towards the idea of a lineage, that we're descended from a line, when in fact we're descended from something more akin to a fractal. The farther back we go in time, the more ancestors we are descended from, and the more diverse their origin places are. So in a sense, there is implicitly in this new genetic science an emerging human ethic, that we're from everywhere. And that we, as being from everywhere, we have a right to be anywhere. And if we have a right to be anywhere, then no borders are legitimate, anywhere in the world. We're in the very early stages of this. This is a human ethic that emerges over maybe a 500-year period. So it's not our lifetimes we're going to see borders disappear. But we're moving in that direction with this reckoning of ourselves through the genetic mirror, the the discovery of the structure of DNA. This is Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallographic photograph 51 of the DNA molecule. That when James Watson saw this, he fathomed the structure, the double helix structure that the DNA was seen from above, in a sense here, and created that X pattern. But the new human ethic is a kind of a new Vitruvian person. We'll call it Vitruvian man. A new kind of human sensibility emerging, where race and ethnicity and cultural expression increasingly will be interrogated. We will find how arbitrary they are, how improvisational they are. They are representing numerous parallel riffs on what it means to be human. And we're also in the early stages of developing the interface with our digital technologies. The embedded nature of these relationships in the way that we use our digital tools. Perpetually, my daughter, 12 years old, perpetually scrolling TikTok in some kind of symbiotic relationship with this tool. So we're in a transitional phase in that respect. So this is one of the areas that I'm really keenly interested in, alongside ancient Mesoamerica and the mestizo mind. So in terms of our family lineage, the family lineage of Chicanx, Mexican-American folks, we have this link to Iberian origins and origins from around the world and indigenous origins. What does it mean to connect to the indigenous origins of ancient Mexico, and what does it mean for the mestizo mind, the mind of those well, we're all really, in fact, genetic science also reveals we're all mestizos. We're all of us mestizos. We're all mixes of many different peoples from around the world. But in this case, the story took me back to Mexico and takes me back to Mexico regularly to explore these connections. This is the great Plaza de Zócalo in the middle of Mexico City, pre-1979. I said that's important because in 1979, the great Aztec temple was discovered over here. And now, if you go to Mexico City, these buildings are all gone because the excavation of the great Aztec temple is now well underway. There's a museum there on that spot. But, you know, one after another of incredible discoveries in Mexico. The sunstone, discovered in 1798 in part of the same plaza, the Zócalo, giving us a sense of the grandeur of Aztec civilization. The goddess Coatlicue, the mother of the great god Huitzilopochtli, the god of the Aztecs, whose hideousness was such that when she was discovered, they immediately buried her. And periodically over the centuries, she would be excavated, brought to light. People would bring her offerings, and they would bury her again. She was too dangerous to bring to light until the 20th century. She now lives in the Museum of Anthropology. So I came up, as many of you did, I'm sure, learning about the integral link we have to Greek civilization, to Roman civilization, to Judeo-Christian tradition and Western European tradition. Any appeal to a link to indigenous sources was often dismissed as either romantic or outright illegitimate. So a great number of us, Chicanx writers, have been for many generations now, for many decades, struggling to establish that connection again by learning more about this legacy. Places like Tula, the great capital of Tula, where the hero god Quetzalcoatl reigned, who was a kind of he's often referred to as the plumed serpent. Sometimes he appears in an incarnation as the wind god. He is also a hero god who rules in this place in Tula. His story is almost indistinguishable. It's almost literally the same story as the King Arthur story. So it's a kind of Jungian archetype story about the emergence of a once and future king. He ends, as King Arthur does, in a disgrace from which he self-exiles and prophesies his return. In the case of Quetzalcoatl, he prophesied his return for a specific year, the year one reed, which turned out to be the year 1519, which was the year the Spaniards arrived, which really freaked out the Aztecs, because the Aztecs were expecting the return of this god. So we're involved in this reflection about our connection to this history, ancient Mesoamerica and the mestizo mind. The mestizo mind, in our case, has often opted for the European cosmovision, the settler colonialist cosmovision. Figures like Carlos Castaneda and Gloria Anzaldúa of South Texas, Carlos Castaneda of, we really don't know where he was from, but he wrote a series of kind of epic series of books dealing with his shamanic initiation into indigenous sources of identity. The mestizo mind opting for the indigenous cosmovision. David Carrasco, the lad in the serape I showed you earlier from one of his books, Mexican Americans, perceiving they've been left out of the official cultural histories in the United States, have turned to indigenous and colonial Mexican culture for inspiration, stories, and symbols. An ongoing project for me. Got these numbers mixed up here. Migrations, transformations, and the question of Texas. Another big part of my work. I do a lot of writing for Texas Monthly. A lot of my writing for Texas Monthly is focused on the question of Texas. What is Texas's story in the long durée, in the long span of time of the emergence of these lands from the American Southwest's origins in colonial New Spain, its transformation into an independent republic, later to a state of the United States, a crossroads of many nations, a state of many worlds, a state of many nations, a crossroads of all the world's peoples. So I look at the story of Texas, in a slightly different lens. Even though I'm a big admirer of a lot of Texas voices like J. Frank Dobie and Willie Nelson and Marcia Ball and Alejandro Escobedo from the musical world. But we have this history, the founding of Texas out of the colonial New Spain story. This is a reproduction of an earlier map from 1748 that was made in 1792, where you see the Rio Grande here, Gulf. And it was the land of the savages. It was the land of the Chichimecas, the people of the dogs. So it became, very early in the story of these lands, it became a contested land. Contested between indigenous and colonial settlers, between Spaniard and indigenous, and then all of the other people who came here to contest these lands. The Rio Grande emerges out of that story kind of as the wound in this narrative, as described by Gloria Anzaldúa, the idea of the border as a wound. I found that it was important, and in the first book, in Farthest Home, I went specifically at investigating the origins of this indigenous ritual, the volador ritual, which is a kind of a dance, a kind of a ceremonial practice, a magical practice, in which there's a reenactment of the descent of the gods from the heavens to the earth through four dancers who descend with their ankles tied to ropes. They eventually make their way in these spiraling motions all the way to the ground. The literature of this tradition, the codex literature, the Spaniards were very effective in extinguishing this record. As José Martí, the Cuban patriot, put it, the conquistadores stole a page from the universe. So we prize these documents that have been maintained, that tell the stories of the indigenous world before the time of the contact. This is the Mapa de Cuauhtincha number 2. It's a kind of a legendary object, about 6 feet by 4 feet in its original form. But it tells the story of the migration of the ancestors out of the place of origin called Chico Mostoc. They go on this long, winding journey. They serve as mercenaries for the capital of Cholula and Puebla, and then they're given land where they settle on in this village here. So this mapa is painted in 1540, but it tells a story from 300 years before. It doesn't refer to the conquest. These people, the people who painted this, already had experienced the conquest, but they were preserving the story, the missing story of themselves, the story of the ancestors. And it was a story that premised the sacred nature of migration, that we migrate to become something new. We migrate to find a new home. We migrate sometimes because our God tells us to migrate. We migrate sometimes because we have a mission. We're going to serve as mercenaries for a powerful empire. So this mapa tells a story about the continuity of migration. It reminds us that all the contested and conflicted and violent migrations we witness today in these very same lands have been going on for millennia. The Mapa de Cuauhtincha tells the story of migration from the north into the south, not from the south to the north. So the orientation of migration will always change, but we are a diasporic, migrant species. And the indigenous people of Mexico recognized that this was a sacred compromiso. The last area of work I'll tell you about, and then I'll begin to close, and we can have a little chat, is actually some collaborations with some folks down the road at Rice, particularly Professor Jeffrey Kripal. That has to do with this theme, which is also the working title of the third of the hallucinated memoir series that I have the first 2 published already. Unimaginable encounters in incredible places. In this case, it has to do really with the continuity, the presence of the paranormal and high strangeness in the lands that we now know as South Texas and the American Southwest. And this goes from everything encompassing the indigenous legacies. This is the digital reproduction of the White Shaman mural outside of Del Rio in the Pecos Gorge, in the Pecos River Gorge, which you can actually make a trek to see. You can go to the site of this mural, take a short hike in, a little arduous, but short. And it's a ritual that enacts some aspects of the peyote ritual that Huicholes, the Huichol people of Mexico, continue to observe. Huicholes came and viewed this mural in recent times and found they were able to tell the story. They were able to narrate the story of this mural. I mentioned that I would go back to the Cabeza de Vaca story. Cabeza de Vaca, specifically in the account that he offers us of his journey from Galveston to Chihuahua, he becomes a healer. He and Estebanico, the first African ancestry person who comes to these lands, part of the group of travelers with Cabeza de Vaca, they both acquire healing powers. Cabeza de Vaca, in his account, claims to rise someone from the dead. So I'm interested in the continuity of these stories dealing with healers in these lands. Don Pedrito Jaramillo, a legendary healer from Falfurrias, Texas, in the valley. The great healer Teresita Urrea, the Santa de Cabora, who did a lot of work in the El Paso area. And a healer that one of my great aunts followed, the Niño Fidencio, the healer of Espinazo in Nuevo León, one of the northern states of Mexico. So I'm interested in how it is when you begin to look at a chronicle of all of the high strangeness in these lands. How do we account for it? Is it about place? Is it about the friction of people encountering each other, strangers encountering each other unexpectedly. The kinds of things that happen when you encounter new cultures, new ways of understanding the world. We also have kind of a long tradition in these lands of fascination with things like UFOs or UAPs, even represented in traditional, these are called, not having anything to do with my family, but they're also called Santos, these depictions of specific incidents, these incidents in which there was some intercession of a saint or a deity in protecting or healing folks. And I'm showing you a few here that deal specifically with UFOs, encounters with UFOs. These are from late 19th century, early 20th century. So I think about this continuity, this chronicle of incredible encounters in unimaginable places as part of the legacy of these lands. Why it was important for me to come back here from New Haven, Connecticut, to come back here from 22 years in New York City, because the story was always about these lands for me. It was always about the setting of Texas, particularly Central and South Texas, in foretelling and foreshadowing what is to come in terms of the future of the United States, and in many respects, the future of the world. This is a representation of a magical landscape in Central Texas. Maybe you might have visited Enchanted Rock just north of Fredericksburg, Texas, a giant granite dome. So I'd always thought about this kind of special nature of this place as being part of this project, the project dealing with our origins, our transformations. I always go back to this quote from Carlos Fuentes, and it sort of helped shape the title of the first book, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation. Does it not raise the possibility that everything in this world is unfinished? And that more specifically, we are unfinished, ourselves, men and women who cannot be declared complete, enclosed within boundaries of finitude and certainty, unfinished even when we die, because forgotten or remembered, we do contribute to a past that our descendants must keep alive if they are to have a future. Forgotten or remembered, we contribute to a past that our descendants must keep alive if they are to have a future. So the obsession with the ancient past, the obsession with the historical past, our grievances, our glories, are connected to who we're becoming. So I mentioned, Laura Writing Jackson as a mentor. One of my other mentors, especially reading parts of the second book, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire, said that I would not be understood in my time. So nobody's going to understand this book. It's a crazy book. The first book is friendly and lots of lovable Mexicans. The second book is partly narrated by a time-traveling cyborg ancestor from the future. And it's a true story. So this mentor said, you're not going to be understood in your time. And he's now passed, but I wanted to show you just as a kind of more of an entertainment. The establishment that, in fact, I might be understood in my time, but after 29 years at least, 29 or 30 years, a 29 or 30 year lag. So I want to show you a little clip of a piece I did in 1991. Well, it's self-explanatory, so I won't say much about it. I'll just show you the clip here. Get back to the, and then we can end. Chat. It's kind of self-explanatory. So this was a clip from a proposal that PBS put to us at the PBS station in New York City, WNET, to create a Saturday Night Live for eggheads. So this was a kind of a nerd, this was meant to be a nerd's Saturday Night Live. It's a very crazy film, but I'm just showing you one little tiny piece of that story. And we'll talk about its significance. Why bring it up now?
Especially on the most working works on it.
So my hair was still
Which
black.
you've already been out to get in some of this workforce.
Yes, I have. One of the things that comes with sweeping political changes are they change your mind on statues. A London statue, for example, you see that on TV being held by the people. They changed the name back to its original name from Morning Rock to St. Petersburg. And when we have statues in our own country, our country is really changing politically as well, not discussing it the Soviet Union. But we have our outdated ideals too. And one of them is right here in our own hometown. In this season of toppling statues and falling idols, we're here in front of the Museum of Natural History in New York City, right in front of the statue of Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. The New York State Legislature commissioned $3.5 million for sculptor James Earl Fraser to execute this statue. That's $1924. Now it's getting a facelift. But maybe it needs a Dushinsky treatment. What does this statue mean to you?
It shows me that there's no prejudice or anything like that because it shows 3 different races.
What does this statue mean to you?
Well, it means a lot because it's an old Theodore Roosevelt and he was a great president once upon a time. Doesn't mean anything to me. It's just a naked man on one side, Indian on the other side, and a man with a shirt on top.
The one on the right looks more like of African descent.
Yeah?
Yeah, it was kind of weird.
When the statue was originally made, I don't think that it was seen as scandalous, and I think a lot of people might try to think of their 90s views and trying to be politically correct.
I think it has a lot to do with the myths involved in America.
It's a racist statue with no prejudice. No, not really. He's kind of showing that he's more, how can you say, advanced than them? White supremacy. Well, the Indian isn't particularly naked. I mean, I think it's just representing minority groups and America and the melting pot.
Does this statue mean you're proud to be an American?
Proud to be American? Well, in a sense, yeah.
Oh, not really, because back in the days, he wasn't nothing really to be proud about. Does this statue make you proud to be an American?
English.
Does this statue make you proud to be an American?
Not really.
Does this statue make you proud to be English?
No, it's relevant to me.
Well, do you think this should have the Dushinsky treatment?
No, I don't think so.
It should be toppled.
You talk about toppling this statue, I don't really see a point behind that. Would I like to see people toppling it into the street? No. Do I think it could be replaced with something more pertinent? Yes.
Well, does this statue reflect any of what's going on today? Yes. But you still see the dynasty, they're still on their horses and the poor is still walking.
Don't buy another two.
So the statue of Teddy Roosevelt went down last year. It is gone now. So that gives me a calibration for the arc of time that's necessary for scurrilous ideas like dismantling the statue of Teddy Roosevelt in 1991. This was a scandalous idea. It wasn't the most scandalous thing in the late city, but it was scandalous. And I would tell my mentor now, if I were in communication with him from the beyond, that in fact, it's not a prospect to not be understood in my time. It's just a 31-year lag. So that may be a reassurance for him. So I just want to end with one more quote from my mentor, Laura Riding Jackson, because this really is the encapsulated version of the charge that she gave me as a writer. I propose that you seek in yourselves remembrance of the before and write what you find and believe your words. No matter how anybody else reads your words, you believe your words. So thank you very much, y'all. I really appreciate this attention and an opportunity to share these ideas. And I'd love to have some chat in case there are any reflections or thoughts or questions. Thank you.
Please, any questions?
Just a comment, I think
Yes.
that was a perfect way to finish your speech.
Teddy Roosevelt disappearing?
No,
Oh.
just to believe in your words.
To believe your words,
Yeah, I
yes.
think that was perfect.
We had a rough relationship, but I always found I was deeply transformed by
You're still
her
using
orientation.
them, so.
Huh?
You're still using them.
I'm still using her stuff. She died in 1991 at the age of 90. Other thoughts? Your own ancestral stories or journeys. Yes.
Have you done any genealogical tracing of your own?
Yeah, so in the second book I deal a lot with that. So in terms of the actual science as well as sort of the results that came about through a Houston-based organization. It's kind of a lower profile genetic science service, not like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, but they're pretty rigorous, called FamilyTreeDNA.com. And they revealed indigenous ancestry on my mother's side, which would have scandalized my grandmother. She thought, we were Iberian entire until my mother married my father, who was a campesino with Kickapoo origins. But on my paternal side, on my dad's campesino Coahuilense side, we discovered Jewish origins, particularly from the Kohanim haplogroup, the guardians of the temple. So I think all of us, my wife is doing a lot of that research that may have revealed that her grandfather was not her biological grandfather. So she's kind of beginning to delve into that with cousins. So it can be fractious. And the science is advancing very rapidly in terms of affordability of reaching farther and farther back in time. Any of you who have done that will know that you get results that go back already 3,000 years or 5,000 years. Actually, it gets more expensive the closer you get to us. So the more expensive tests will give you greater detail about the last 300 years. But we're learning a lot about how restless our ancestors were, as represented in those illustrations. So, when we think about the time span of this, the discovery of the DNA molecule in the 50s, the structure of the DNA molecule in the 50s, the discovery really of the genealogical science in the 90s. So we're in the earliest fleshing out of the implications of these new understandings of ourselves. I think of it as this new genetic mirror that will be a part of how we all think of ourselves very soon. Being able to gaze into that mirror and see these distant ancestral sources. And then how do we give voice to that? How do we find ways to give voice to that, to give image to that? Thank you. Other thoughts or questions, Hillary?
Dennis, you want to ask a question?
I think one of the, I started to try to trace some of the family history.
Yeah.
And it got sticky to try to figure it out.
Yeah, well, ultimately, the farther and farther back you go, you get to that very blurry horizon of humanity's origins. How do we begin? How does the human story begin? So if you know the beginning of 2001, A Space Odyssey, it begins with Stanley Kubrick's account of how humanity begins. It basically begins the story with violence. Violence between kindred folk is the way that he sets out the tale. So the genetic mirror takes us back to that vanishing point where we have to contend with humanity's origins, how we emerge as a species, and what the purpose of this entire journey has been, what we make of this journey, and what we're becoming.
I think that's a perfect question, because when I came here, my initial perspective of your speech was, Journey Without a Path, like not necessarily like a dedicated education or guidance or support. It was just following, but really more it was like an understanding for you. You use that understanding to understand yourself, and then it went deeper and beyond that, and you become, it's a whole career, but it doesn't seem like just a career, it's more of a whole life dedication.
That is so beautiful. That is such a beautiful
Well, just
telling
like
of this story.
It's a lot of work, so you kept going.
Well,
So you're not
each of us
misunderstanding
carries
yourself.
this possibility of always making whatever we're involved with in our work connected to this quest,
But you
this
went past
lifelong
your
inquiry.
work. It's like you wanted to understand it all.
Yeah, I left out the tough parts. I left out the bumpy bits and the deep uncertainties and the troubling confusion, the sense of like
But it's
not
not
knowing which way to go.
with all the time, it
So,
sounds like.
a longer version of it, and those are in the books, tell, the rockier tale. But, and these stories also, in many cases, deal with specific people. So I wasn't narrating the story of the people who helped me along this way. But all of us have in our lives people who can help us on that way, whether they're mentors or allies, people we encounter by chance. All of those contribute to making this work as a way of thinking about scholarship, the role of humanities, particularly for me, poetry, music, art, literature, as a way of finding that missing story of ourselves that Laura Riding Jackson talks about. And that evocation that she has at the end of that quote, that, until we have the missing story of ourselves, we go on quietly craving it. We have this craving for it.
Yeah.
We see glimpses of it in movies, we see glimpses of it in things we read, but that's not the missing story of ourselves. So we're called on to do that story. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Fellow Dame Dermot, yes.
A thing that my family has learned from all of this DNA, trace your ancestry stuff, is that everybody's Irish.
That is actually true.
I have fantasies. I was thinking, Spanish Armada, lands on the coast of Ireland. I'm descended from Arab princes and African kings. And no.
The Irish are always at the center of the story. They're it's one of the paradigmatic lineages.
Thank you. And I have a poem about myself called Resonate. It kind of tracks what I look for instead, which is little snippets of cultural information.
Yeah.
And those are things that have made me too.
Yeah.
The poem ends by saying, because of the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, this is true that it's complicated. I lived in Galveston, Texas, in a wooden house.
Yes.
So it just goes back all down the highways and the byways and the towns and the paths up the volcano. It's satisfying in another way without having the multiple ancestries that so many other people have.
Arriving in an unknown place where my mom's family had left in the 1590s, Asturias in northern Spain on the Cantabrian Sea. I got to Asturias, and the Asturianos are very proud. They were never subject to Moorish rule. They were always independent, and they led the Reconquista, the expulsion of the Moors and the Jews from Spain. So they're very proud Asturianos. They are also proud Spaniards, but above all else, they're Celts. They're Celts. So they go back, they trace their origins to the arrival of Celts in the 8th century. And so when you go to Asturias, you hear flamenco singing, but accompanied by bagpipes. So the Celtic energy throughout Central Europe, the way in which Celts marked cultural formation, the monuments of stone left all over the European landscape, all have this origin. So I'm not kidding that the Irish are always sort of deeply embedded in the early parts of this story. My Irish friends always remind me too. So. Yes?
Is there anything interesting you learned about yourself while researching?
Thank you for that question. Well, a whole lot, maybe, but the strangest thing, and as I said earlier, it has to do with the narrative in the second book, where I tell the story about a voice that's been in my head since I was about 12 years old. And the voice in my head was a kind of another mentor of sorts, an orienting presence. In the writing of the second book, I came to realize that this was more than just a presence, and that presence expressed itself and described itself. It has a name, Cenote Siete, a jungle spring 7, and revealed himself, as I said earlier, as a time-traveling ancestor from the future. So a presence who's from the future, who's been in interaction with my ancestors in the past, because he can traverse time using DNA radio waves, and has shaped our journey over many generations. So that's a pretty strange thing to kind of come across along the way of writing these stories. Write what you find and believe your words, And in fact, right now, part of the third book has to do with trying to come to terms with what that story is really about and what happened when I was 12 and how it echoes into the present. So that may be the standout, but I learned that there were lots of intrigues about the family story that just had not been told. The first book deals in part with my grandfather's death. His body was found in the San Antonio River in 1938, and unclear whether it was possibly a murder or more likely a suicide. But it was a story that was never spoken of in our family. So the first book deals with, for many of us, I think we carry stories in our families that are not spoken, and what it means then to go at those stories, and what it can potentially do to the pain that people are carrying as a result of stories from the past. So that was another aspect of things learned along the way that you can't anticipate what the end will be. And in that case, my dad was integrally involved in the story because he found his dad's body. But we never got a chance to talk about it because right as I was finishing the book in 1998, my dad was in a car crash that took his life before I could share the book with him, before I could share the story with him. And that presence, that voice that I talked about earlier, the Cenote Siete voice, one of the things that happened when I was 12 was a premonition about my dad's death in a car crash. So very strange tales. The books carry the full detail of it. Yes.
I'm sorry, you can wait for me. In the second book, you mentioned these far-fetching concepts. Do you have references or supporting things like in the book to,
Oh yes. Well, you have to sort those out. Yeah. I tell people how this came about, and how I came to terms with it.
And people who support those concepts too, of like the.
It depends a lot on the reader. It depends. We really almost split the book. Half of the book is his, half of the book is mine.
And when you say his, you mean?
Cenote Siete.
Okay.
This figure I described, Cenote Siete. Jungle Spring 7 is the name he presents as his identifying name.
Yeah, maybe one more question.
One more question.
In your research into the myths, archetypes, and traditions of the past and how it informs your writing, I'm just curious, have you noticed some of those roots being drawn from other Chicano writers? Like, are there some archetypes that contemporary writers return to time and again, or is there more of a diversity of different perspectives depending on who the storyteller is?
Thank you for that. a lot of Chicanx writers from the time of the Movimiento, the late 60s, early 70s, began reaching towards these deep Mesoamerican indigenous legacies as a way of understanding who we are. It just so happens that the last 50 years have been a golden age of Mexican archaeology. We have discovered extraordinary things, excavations that are happening right now. We were there in October looking at 2 excavations, one at the pyramid city of Teotihuacan and the new excavations around the Great Temple in Mexico City. There's been this explosion of knowledge about what it means to really understand the cosmovision of the Aztec world and the way they embodied that vision in terms of objects and literature and artistic expression. So there's a new wave of writers dealing with this material. The one I mentioned earlier is, I think, a paradigmatic one that's important because it kind of illustrates the way that these myths in Mexico have this archetypal resonance. The fact that the Quetzalcoatl story, which comes out of central Mexico, one of the pivotal deities of central Mexico, who eventually also has a great following in the Yucatan region, that the story should be so identical to the King Arthur story. And it makes Mesoamerican scholars very uncomfortable to bring that up. It makes Arthurian scholars very uncomfortable to bring that up. But that's one of many. So the writer I pointed to, Gloria Ansaldúa, in her book Borderlands, La Frontera, you'll see that she embraces particularly that monstrous figure of Coatlicue, the serpent-headed, serpent-skirted goddess, Coatlicue, as being emblematic of surviving sexual violence, the violence of the creation of the U.S.-Mexico border. So writers take on these mythic narratives in various ways that really speak to their own orientation towards the landscape of whether it's South Texas or the greater southwestern borderlands, or, as in my case, trying to return to Mexico to fathom those sources in places like Puebla and Mexico City and Teotihuacan. It was feasible to do that when I was coming of age in the 90s, when you could go to Mexico City, rent a VW Bug, and then just set out without worrying about where you were going to end your day. You can't do that kind of travel right now in Mexico. So there's a chill right now on Mexican American writers being able to go there and wander freely in the way that I was able to, which is really regrettable. But it's a really important new arena of possibility, something that we're all excited about as younger writers begin to fully take stock of what has been discovered in the last 50 years, which is mind-blowing. Get into another topic.
Okay,
Thanks, y'all.
let's
Really
thank
appreciate it.
the speaker again.
Thank you.